In this lesson, we are going to continue the impact of African Americans on the culture and economy of South Carolina. We learned that the South Carolina economy, like all of the southern colonies, was based on the plantation system. This was because the lord proprietors, in order to attract renters to the Carolinas, enacted the headright method. The headright method would result in the formation of large plantations. And on these plantations, there would be necessary to have a labor force. In South Carolina, the first labor source they tried was natives. The natives were a poor labor source, though, because the men didn't farm, they escaped, and disease eventually killed many of them. Virginia used indentured servants, but South Carolina did not use indentured servants because by the time South Carolina was established, people were not willing to sign the contract of indenture like they were in Virginia. Now, most of South Carolina's labor source was African slaves. These African slaves first came with the Barbadians, who were British that lived on the island of Barbados, but brought their slave system and slaves to South Carolina. The Barbadians also brought their established slave codes, which said slaves are property, they have no rights, but there was some protection against cruelty. The rest of the slaves that came to the Carolinas would come on the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas. And most of the slaves that arrived in South Carolina arrived through the port of Charlestown. The slaves would bring pieces of culture from Africa, which included their Gullah or Geechee language, dance, the call and response songs, wood carving, basket weaving, drums, their of the food that they ate in Africa, yams, and their folk medicine. They also brought knowledge of rice cultivation, which would be South Carolina's first cash crop, and the knowledge to cultivate rice came from slaves. The English had no idea how to cultivate rice, but African Americans did, and it would become the most important cash crop in the Carolinas for its first 100 years of existence. These slaves also brought advanced knowledge of how to tend cattle and how to harvest naval stores, which made the ships watertight and was a valuable commodity all over the world. The result of this many slaves coming in started to result in a racial imbalance that began to exist in South Carolina, which made the whites scared because the whites were keeping a population of slaves and forcing them to do labor, but the slaves were starting to outnumber the whites. You can see from this map that South Carolina was colored. More than 50% of the people in this dark brown area were slaves. So the whites were outnumbered here. Now this is more close to the Civil War, but the same thing existed back during the time period we're talking about in the early 1700s. South Carolina back then, though, really the only populated areas was this area, the low country around Charleston. But this racial imbalance, there were more slaves than there were whites, and the whites were getting scared. However, the General Assembly did nothing to limit the amount of slaves that were coming in. These fears were realized when, in 1739, there was a slave rebellion near Charleston in southern Charlestown called the Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion happened just south of Charlestown. There's a river called the Stono River. You will be able to see it on future slides in this presentation. But the Stono Rebellion occurred, and it was the largest slave insurrection in British North America. It began when 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stono River. There they took guns and other weapons. They killed the 2 shopkeepers. The rebels still marched south towards promised freedom in Spanish Florida, waving flags, beating drums, and shouting liberty. The Spanish were actually complicit in the Stono Rebellion because they sent word that any slaves that rebelled against their British masters and made it to Spanish Florida would receive freedom there. The Stono Rebellion continued because the rebels were joined by 40 to 60 more during a 15-mile march. They killed at least 20 whites, but spared others. The rebellion ended late that afternoon when the militia caught the rebels. Important during the Stono Rebellion was the role of drums. The slaves used drums to gain support for their rebellion. They played these war beats that the slaves on other plantations knew meant war, and the use of drums alerted these slaves on other plantations that there was a rebellion going on, and 40 to 60 started to rebel against their masters. So eventually, the white militia catches up with the rebels. They kill at least 34 of them, and most of who escaped were eventually captured and executed. Any that were forced to join the rebels were released. The South Carolina Assembly soon enacted a harsh slave code in force until 1865 as a result of the Stono Rebellion. So the Stono Rebellion was a slave rebellion. What we're most concerned about is that the result of the Stono Rebellion was a strengthening of the slave codes that were already existent. In the earlier lesson and on the previous slide, I showed you the original Barbados slave codes. Well, those slave codes were kind of vague in nature. The slave codes of 1740, which came about after the Stono Rebellion, would be very specific, and it would control minute aspects of the slaves' lives. The slave codes of 1740 were also known as the Negro Act, which is the Spanish word for black, of course. Now, as per the slave codes of 1740, slaves were prohibited from doing several things. Of course, we learned about the culture of the slaves and the role of drums. After 1740, slaves were not allowed to play the drums, for obvious reasons, because that was part of the Stono Rebellion, and why it grew was because of the drums. Now, some of the slave codes were slaves they were not allowed to gather without white supervision. So, no more gathering of slaves in a big group unless there is white supervision. Now, one of the most interesting slave codes that resulted from the Stono Rebellion was that slaves were prohibited to learn how to read or write. Now, the reason that this prohibition came about was because the Spanish sent word throughout the colonies to the slaves in the form of written communication about their deal that if they rebel and come to the South, that they will receive freedom. This was also to cut off any ideas that the slaves may have about promised freedom elsewhere, such as the North, because there was a growing abolitionist movement about this time as well. The third slave code was slaves were prohibited from carrying a gun. The fourth was slaves were not allowed to dress above the condition of a slave. So it was sort of a way to identify the slaves as, okay, they're dressed in the standard slave attire of a standard cloth as opposed to being dressed more intricately. Now, as a result of the slave codes, there was also harsh punishment for the breaking of laws. And there was very little protection for cruelty to slaves. Owners could be fined for cruelty. So the big idea is this Stono Rebellion. This results in laws and restrictions to control the slaves. Existing laws were present. However, after Stono, the laws were made more harsh and controlled the minute aspects of the slaves' lives. Now, once again, partially this is concerns about the racial imbalance in South Carolina. Of note is that even though these harsh slave codes were enacted after the Stono Rebellion, there was no effort to limit the slave trade at all. So even though there was a rebellion which killed 20 whites and brought havoc to the country, or to the countryside, there was no effort to limit the slave trade at all, because the money you could make with slaves were just too valuable. So, in 1698, this racial imbalance, the Stono Rebellion was in 1740. This General Assembly was worried that slaves outnumbered whites. However, they did not want to limit the amount of slaves coming in due to their economic value. The Stono Rebellion occurs shortly after that, 40 years. This is a picture of a slave rebellion. Here's the Stono River that we can see. Here's downtown Charleston. A little south and west of Charleston is where the Stono River is. The outcome of the Stono Rebellion was harsh slave codes. This allowed for tighter control of slaves. Some of these slave codes prohibited slaves from gathering, from learning how to read and write, from carrying a gun, and from being allowed to dress above the condition of slaves. Once again, the Spanish were complicit in the Stono Rebellion because they offered freedom to those slaves who rebelled against their British masters. Additional pieces of these slave codes were there was harsh punishment for breaking laws, and the owners could be fined if they were cruel to their slaves. Of particular note, even though a population imbalance favoring slaves was seen as a threat, the slave trade was still not limited. The next part of the lesson is the circumstances under which a slave can be freed and resulting stipulations on that freedom. The South Carolina legislature acknowledged the right of masters to free or manumit, a word that means free, their slaves. There were 4 basic reasons why a slave could be freed. Keep in mind, slaves are valuable property, though, and this was an unusual occurrence. But one of these reasons was faithful service. Sometimes a master may free a slave merely because they have worked hard for that master all their life, and the master feels that they deserve freedom. There's the second reason that a slave may be freed is if the owner has it in their will, in their last will and testament. Now, people leave a will for when they pass away to determine who gets their property most often. Sometimes in the will, sometimes when the owners died, they would have in their will that the slaves were to be freed. George Washington actually did this and freed his slaves in his will. Now, if it's not in the will that the slaves are to be freed, then they are passed on as any other property. So sometimes slaves were freed when the owners died, if it's in the will. Another way that slaves will sometimes earn their freedom would be they would purchase themselves. The slave work week was 6 days, Monday through Saturday. Slaves were off on Sundays. We've talked about this in many classes already. Some slaves had skills, and they would go work and earn money. And under rare circumstances, they could buy their freedom. One interesting story is of a slave named Denmark Vesey, who was in South Carolina, who did work as a carpenter and earned money. However, he didn't earn enough money, so what he did is he played the lottery. He won the lottery and won a large sum of money and was able to earn his freedom. He was later accused of leading a slave rebellion, though, and was executed. So he was lucky to win the lottery, but unlucky to be accused of leading this slave rebellion. We will learn more about him in a couple months. The fourth reason that slaves could be freed is, in rare occasions, owners would have children with slaves, and they may free their children or their slave mistress. Now, there was a stipulation on the freedom in South Carolina. You can see here's a picture of a slave named Dinah Morris receiving her certificate of freedom or certificate of manumission. Now, most slaves, when they were freed, would want to go north because they knew that the north had less problems. If slaves were freed in South Carolina, they would normally want to go north because they were more sympathetic in the north to freed slaves. In fact, South Carolina was not sympathetic at all. If you were a slave, you had better leave in 6 months or you would be re-enslaved. So if you were one of those slaves that could either be given or purchase your freedom, you had better get out or you may be re-enslaved. This is a repeat of what was already said. However, you can see this, am I not a man and a brother? Kind of a questioning, how can you keep slaves? South Carolina had very few free slaves. They were too valuable. Owners could manumit or free their slaves. Some owners freed their slaves when they died, if it was in their will. Didn't happen if it wasn't in their will. Some purchased their freedom, like Denmark Vesey. However, freed slaves had to leave South Carolina within 6 months or be re-enslaved and sold at auction. Most moved to the north or to the cities or urban areas. After the American Revolution, restrictions on the right of owners to free their slaves were tightened. This completes the lesson for today on African American culture and its impact on South Carolina. Thank you for listening. I hope you did well.